We flew to Greenland on United's new Newark to Nuuk route, planning a short stay in Nuuk before continuing on to Ilulissat, the destination our entire trip was built around. Once we arrived, a series of flight cancellations, operational issues, and weather disruptions inside Greenland made it impossible to reach Ilulissat at all. We were repeatedly rebooked, delayed, and ultimately stranded, while prepaid tours, hotels, and flights continued to expire. By the time we flew home, the trip was over. The itinerary was gone, and thousands of dollars were tied up in experiences that we never actually received. If you're new here, my name's Mary, and I teach people how to travel the world on points and miles. But this series is different. In parts 1 and 2 of this series, I walked through exactly how that happened. In part 3, I showed how we were ultimately able to recover the money. But this video is different. This isn't about what we did wrong, because structurally, this trip failed even though we built in buffer time, booked ahead, and followed the rules as they were presented. This video is about why it happened, because the more I dug into Greenland's flight schedules, airport operations, staffing limitations, and airline structure, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a travel nightmare. It was a system under strain. Greenland is being marketed as more accessible than ever, but accessibility doesn't mean reliability. So in this video, I'm approaching Greenland travel the way a journalist would, researching primary sources, looking at the infrastructure, the airlines, and the constraints that don't show up in marketing brochures. Now let's get into it. To understand why things fell apart so quickly, you first have to understand how travel in Greenland actually works, and how different it is from almost anywhere else in the world. Greenland is massive, with about 56,000 people spread across the coastline that stretches thousands of miles. And there are virtually no roads connecting towns. None. You cannot drive from one city to another. So if you want to move around Greenland, you either fly or you travel by boat. Flights are the backbone of domestic travel. Small aircraft connects towns along the coast when everything works. Boats operate seasonally and are slower, weather dependent, and not always practical for tight itineraries. This means that Greenland operates on a fundamentally fragile transportation model. Every domestic flight matters. Every delay ripples outward. And unlike most places, there isn't a backup built into the system. Planes are small, routes are limited, there isn't another airline to rebook onto, flight frequencies are low, and when weather rolls in, which it often does, there is no road network to fall back on and very few alternate ways to reroute people. So even before Greenland started opening up to more international tourism, it was already a destination where everything had to go right for a trip to work. That's the baseline. For decades, international access to Greenland was limited. Most travelers arrived via Denmark or Iceland and then connected onward using smaller domestic aircraft. That structure didn't just limit tourism, it acted as a pressure valve. Fewer flights, fewer people, lower expectations of flexibility. That changed with Nuuk's runway expansion, which opened in late 2024. Nuuk's runway was extended to accommodate larger jet aircraft, unlocking something that Greenland had never really had before: direct, long-haul international flights into its capital. From a tourism perspective, this was framed as a breakthrough: shorter travel times, fewer connections, and easier access for international travelers. But infrastructure upgrades don't just enable opportunity, they also concentrate risk. Because as Nuuk became more accessible, it also became the primary hub for Greenland's air traffic. Historically, Greenland's international gateway was more distributed, with Ilulissat playing a central role even though it wasn't a population center. With Nuuk's upgrade, that model shifted. International arrivals now funnel into Nuuk, and domestic connections hinge on that single hub functioning smoothly. When everything works, the hub model feels efficient. When it doesn't, disruptions compound quickly. If weather, staffing, security screening, or aircraft availability affects Nuuk, then domestic departures back up. Passengers pile up, rebooking options shrink, hotels and taxis fill immediately, and delays ripple across Greenland. In other words, Nuke's upgrade didn't just improve access, it centralized failure points. Now layer in another major change, direct U.S. routes. United's Newark to Nuke service was marketed as a milestone, and it is, but here's the nuance that most people overlook. That route only operates a couple times a week. So if that flight is delayed or canceled, you're not taking the next one a day later. Your next opportunity to enter or exit Greenland might not be until several days later. This is what I call the frequency trap. You can have multiple daily domestic flights on paper, like Nuke to Ilulissat in summer, but when your entire trip depends on a narrow international entry window, one failure can collapse everything downstream. Your hotels, your tours, your domestic flights. This is why Greenland travel has such a narrow margin for error. The moment you miss that entry window, the entire itinerary can start unraveling. Not because of poor planning, but because the system doesn't offer a quick recovery path. And this is where a lot of travelers get caught off guard. Many people assume that flights in and around Greenland are protected under EU passenger compensation rules like EU 261, but it's not that simple. Air Greenland is a Greenlandic airline, not an EU airline. According to Air Greenland's own policies, EU 261 can apply in certain cases, such as when a journey departs from an EU country. But those EU compensation rules do not apply to departures out of Greenland towards an EU country, departures within Greenland, or departures from the US to Greenland operated by a non-EU airline. So once you're inside Greenland, many of the protections people expect when traveling in Europe don't apply the same way. And that matters because it changes how much risk you personally carry when the system breaks down. Here's where things really start to click. Once you understand the system, what happened to us doesn't look like random bad luck. It looks structural. First, you have to understand that weather in Greenland isn't just a footnote. It's a core planning variable. Even in the summer, high winds, fog, sudden storms, rapid weather shifts, these aren't rare events, they're expected. And when you're operating flights in an Arctic environment, weather doesn't just delay one plane, it can shut down an entire day of operations. Now layer that on top of a flight network with small fleets and limited flexibility. When a flight cancels, there isn't a lineup of spare aircraft waiting. There isn't another airline to rebook onto. One cancellation pushes passengers onto the next flight, which is also small and often already full. And that's why recovery is slow. One weather disruption quickly turns into a domino effect because every canceled flight pushes passengers onto the next one, and the system doesn't have much slack to absorb that extra amount of passengers. Then add in airport operations, specifically staffing and security processing at Nuuk Airport. On the morning our flight was supposed to leave, security didn't even open on time. There was confusion, a lack of staff, no clear communication, and a backlog that immediately threw off the entire morning schedule. And when you're dealing with a small airport, a late security opening doesn't just cause a delay, it can derail every departure behind it. Air Greenland itself has acknowledged that delays at Nuuk have been tied not just to weather, but to security processing and airport operational constraints. When staffing is thin and systems aren't fully stabilized, there's no buffer. A single breakdown cascades quickly. And this isn't just anecdotal. Back in August 2025, there were documented issues with international security screening requirements at Nuuk, including periods where international operations were disrupted or limited because training and security requirements weren't fully met. During at least one incident, international flights were impacted so badly that the aircraft had to divert or turn back. And that's a big deal because international aviation isn't optional or flexible about security standards. If an airport can't meet them consistently, flights don't just run late, they don't run at all. Now, add one more layer into this, the aircraft themselves. Much of Greenland's domestic and regional flying relies on very small planes, historically 37-seat turboprops. That works when everything runs smoothly, but when things go wrong, it becomes a bottleneck fast. If a flight with 37 seats gets canceled, those passengers don't just magically disappear. They all need to be rebooked onto other flights that are also small and often already full. That's why recovery is so slow. You're not redistributing people across wide-body jets with hundreds of seats. You're trying to reshuffle dozens of passengers through a system with extremely limited capacity. And that leads to the final piece that people don't like to talk about: customer service reality. When a lot of flights cancel at once, the number of passengers needing help just explodes. But that number of staff available to help them doesn't, even though it should. In small systems like this, there simply aren't enough people to manage mass disruptions in real time. Phones go unanswered, desks are unstaffed, emails pile up, but there needs to be some accountability here. What we experienced wasn't some unavoidable consequence of traveling to a remote place. This happened because demand increased. International flights were added, tourism was actively encouraged. Without the staffing, operational capacity, or customer support infrastructure being scaled alongside it. When airports expand, when airlines add new international routes, when tourism boards market accessibility, there's a responsibility to make sure that the systems behind the scenes can actually support that growth. And in Greenland, particularly in Nuuk, that scaling clearly hasn't caught up yet. So when you put all of this together, unpredictable weather, thin staffing, security constraints, tiny aircraft, limited backup options, you get a system where one disruption doesn't stay contained. It spreads. And once it starts spreading, there's no easy way to stop it. That's why people get stranded for days. That's why rebooking feels impossible. That's why hotels fill up. That's why tours disappear. And that's why, when something goes wrong in Greenland, it tends to go very wrong. So after everything I've showed you, you might be wondering if I'm saying don't go to Greenland at all. And no, that's not what I'm saying. Greenland is incredible, but it's not a destination that you plan in the same way that you'd plan Europe, Japan, or even Iceland. If you still want to go, here's what works. First, build in more buffer time than you think you need, especially between your international arrival, your domestic flights, and your return home. If your trip hinges on one flight operating on one specific day, then you're gambling. You should at minimum consider having 2, if not 3 days of buffer time in between your international flights and your domestic intra-Greenland flights. That way, if the first flight is delayed or canceled, you're not immediately blowing up your entire itinerary. Second, accept that you'll probably need to book tours in advance. Most of the experiences people go to Greenland for book up far ahead, and many have strict non-refundable policies, even if your flight is canceled. And you don't want to travel all the way to Greenland and not be able to get out on the water and explore the landscape. So that doesn't eliminate risk, it just moves it to you. So you need to protect yourself financially. This is where travel insurance becomes a necessity, not an upsell. Not because it fixes delays, but because it's often the only backstop when the domino effect starts. So look for policies that include trip delay and trip interruption coverage, coverage for missed tours, extra meals, additional hotels, and transportation costs when your itinerary collapses. And don't rely solely on credit card insurance for a trip like Greenland. Credit card protections are narrow. They're designed for short delays, often require you to pay for the entire trip on that card, and usually don't cover prepaid experiences the same way standalone insurance does. In my case, travel insurance didn't just help, it was the difference between absorbing a $3,400 loss and being made whole. And I'm still not someone who buys insurance for every trip. But when you're stacking non-refundable experiences on top of limited flights with no redundancy, self-insuring with credit cards just isn't enough. I'll link the exact company that I used, World Nomads, in the description below because they covered everything I asked them to, including missed tours, excess meal costs, and transportation. But they're not the only option, so I'll link a few other providers as well. And finally, when you do experience delays and cancellations, assume that resolution will be slow. Customer service lines will be long, escalation options will be limited, and answers won't come quickly. Save every receipt, keep cancellation emails, screenshot rebookings, push Air Greenland to provide written notice of delays so that you can send those into your travel insurance later, And just try as much as you can to keep your cool and enjoy what you can out of the trip. Because when things unravel in Greenland, the people who get made whole aren't the loudest, they're the most organized. So if you take nothing else from this video, let it be this. What happened to us in Greenland wasn't bad luck. It was the predictable outcome of a system that looks accessible on the surface, but still has real structural limitations underneath. Greenland is extraordinary, but it's not forgiving. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't go. It just means that you need to plan differently. You need time buffers. You need to understand how fragile the flight network actually is. You need to assume that if something goes wrong, it won't be fixed quickly. And you need to protect yourself financially before you ever board a plane. If you want to see how this played out in real life, parts 1 through 3 of this series are linked in the description. And if this helped you think differently about how to plan remote trips, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with anyone who's been eyeing Greenland and thinking, how hard could it really be? Because now you know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.